Somewhere in a garden in rural France in the 1840s, a woman walks out before sunrise and cuts a handful of leaves from the same plant her grandmother planted. That plant is still there. It has never been replaced. It has never been purchased again. It simply grew back every spring and for decades. That plant is not a mystery. It is not a secret. It is a perennial vegetable, and it is the kind of plant that built the food security of the old world, quietly, reliably, year after year, before industrial agriculture decided that dependability was less valuable than dependency. This video is about 3 of those plants, 3 roots that produce food from the same ground, season after season, without requiring seeds, without requiring inputs, and without requiring you to start over every spring. One of them sustained entire villages through the winters of northern Europe for centuries. One of them is native to this continent and was a primary caloric source for dozens of indigenous nations long before European settlers arrived. And one of them, the most modest of the 3, has been quietly producing the first greens of spring in the same garden beds since the Middle Ages. By the end of this video, you will understand not only what these plants are and how they work, but why they disappeared from mainstream gardening culture, and why that disappearance was not an accident. To understand why these plants were left behind, it is necessary to understand the system that replaced them. For most of human agricultural history, a functional food garden had 2 layers. There was the annual layer, crops planted each season, harvested, and replanted the following year. And there was the perennial layer, a permanent backbone of roots, crowns, and bulbs that came back on their own, required little maintenance, and produced food year after year from the same established plants. That perennial layer was not a luxury. It was insurance. In bad years, when harvests failed, when seeds were scarce, when resources were limited, the perennial roots were still there. They had survived winters. They had deepened their root systems. They were, in every practical sense, more stable than anything that needed to be replanted. Then came industrialization, and with it a shift toward monoculture farming, the mass production of a small number of annual crops, grown at scale, sold through centralized systems, and replanted from purchased seed every single season. Annual crops are a reliable business model. They require seeds. Seeds require suppliers. Suppliers require repeat customers. Every year the cycle begins again. And the garden that sustains itself, the garden with the deep perennial roots that need nothing from the catalogue, has no place in that model. This is not a theory. It is simply an observation about economic incentives. A plant that you plant once and harvest for 20 years generates 1 sale. A plant you replant every spring generates 20. The result over the course of a century is that the perennial vegetable garden, once a standard feature of every serious kitchen garden in the Western world, became a rarity. Not because the plants stopped working, because they were never going to make anyone wealthy. Before we look at the 3 plants, leave a comment below. Do you currently grow any perennial vegetables, or is everything in your garden replanted each season? It matters more than most gardeners realize, and the conversation in the comments is worth reading. The first plant has a name that sounds like folklore, and a behavior that borders on remarkable. The Egyptian walking onion, Allium proliferum, has been cultivated continuously for several thousand years. Its origins trace to the Middle East and Central Asia, though it spread through Eastern Europe and became a fixture in kitchen gardens across the continent for centuries. It is not a modern variety. It is not a hybrid. It is among the oldest cultivated alliums still in active use. What makes it unusual, and what earns it the name walking, is its reproductive mechanism. Unlike a conventional onion, which develops a single bulb below ground and is harvested at season's end, the Egyptian walking onion produces small clusters of bulbils at the very top of its stalks. These topsets, as they are called, form above ground in full view, and as the season progresses, the weight of those topsets causes the stalk to arch and bend toward the soil. When the topsets make contact with the ground, they take root. A new cluster of plants begins to grow a short distance from the parent. The following season, those plants do the same. Over years, the colony moves, incrementally, measurably, across the bed. Hence, walking. This is a plant with no dormant season in moderate climates. The greens are harvestable in late winter and early spring, often before any other edible green is ready. The underground bulbs are edible. The top sets are edible. The stalks are edible. There is almost no point in the year when the plant offers nothing, and it is entirely self-sustaining. It requires no seed purchase, no replanting, no intervention beyond the most basic maintenance. A single planting, properly established, can remain productive for decades. It does not appear in most seed catalogues. It is not sold at garden centers. It is passed between gardeners, as it has been for generations. That, in itself, is a meaningful detail. The second plant is perhaps the most productive perennial vegetable on this continent, and paradoxically, one of the most underutilized in modern gardens. The Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus, is native to eastern North America. It is a member of the sunflower family, and in late summer it produces tall, vigorous stalks that can reach 10 feet in height, topped with clusters of yellow flowers. But the edible part of the plant grows underground, dense, irregular tubers that accumulate in significant quantities each season. Its history as a food plant predates European contact. Numerous indigenous nations across the continent cultivated and consumed sunchokes as a reliable caloric staple, valued for their productivity, their cold hardiness, and their ability to persist in soils and climates that would challenge most crops. When European explorers encountered the plant in the early 17th century, they brought it back to Europe. For a period, it was widely grown across France and parts of northern Europe, particularly during periods of scarcity when other crops failed. It thrived in poor soils, it required minimal care, it survived harsh winters, and it produced abundantly. The perennial mechanism is straightforward. Harvest the tubers at season's end, but do not harvest all of them. Any tubers left in the ground over winter will regenerate the following spring. In practice, this happens whether you intend it or not. The tubers are numerous, small and difficult to extract completely. A sunchoke patch, once established, tends to persist. Removing it entirely requires deliberate effort. That persistence, often cited as a reason some gardeners are cautious about planting it, is precisely what makes it valuable from a food security perspective. It does not require intervention to survive. It does not depend on ideal conditions. It simply grows, produces, and grows again. The tubers are nutritionally dense, high in inulin, of all prebiotic fiber, with a flavor often described as nutty and slightly sweet. They can be roasted, boiled, eaten raw, or prepared in any of the ways one would use a root vegetable. If you want the complete planting and harvesting detail on the sunchoke, along with the other plants in this video, I put together a 121-page reference guide specifically on perennial vegetables. It covers each plant in depth: history, growing behavior, planting guidance, harvesting approach, and common mistakes. The link is in the description below. The third plant is the quietest of the three. It does not walk, it does not spread aggressively, it simply endures, and in doing so, it produces reliably when almost nothing else will. Sorrel, Rumex acetosa, has been a fixture of European kitchen gardens since at least the medieval period. Historical records of its cultivation stretch back further still. It is a leafy green with a distinctive, sharp, acidic flavor derived from its high oxalic acid content, described variously as lemony, tart, or bracingly sour. It was used widely in soups, sauces, and as a spring green, and was considered an essential component of any well-managed kitchen garden. What makes sorrel remarkable as a perennial is not its yield in a single harvest, but the consistency of its production over time. The plant overwinters as a root. In early spring, often before the last frosts have fully passed, new growth pushes up from that root. In many climates, sorrel is the first edible green of the year. It is harvestable weeks before most spring crops are even seeded. The leaves are cut and regrow, cut again, and they regrow again. The root system deepens and expands over successive years, making the plant progressively more robust. A well-established sorrel plant, 3 or 4 years into its life, produces substantially more than a newly planted one. The old-growth plants are, in most measurable ways, superior to new ones. This is a pattern that runs through all 3 of the plants in this video, they improve with time. The root systems become more extensive. The plants become more resilient. The harvests, in many cases, become larger. They are not designed for the short-term productivity curve that annual agriculture optimizes for. They are designed for the long term, and in the long term, they tend to deliver. A healthy sorrel plant can remain productive for 15 to 20 years, in some documented cases, longer. It requires almost no inputs. It does not need to be replaced. It asks only to be left alone long enough to establish itself. It is, in the most literal sense, a permanent feature of the garden, if you choose to let it become one. If this kind of content, the history of food plants, the logic of long-term gardening, the record of what was known and what was forgotten, if that is what you are looking for, subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. It helps this content reach the people who are actively looking for it. 3 plants, 3 different mechanisms, 3 different histories, but the same underlying principle. A garden built on perennial roots does not reset. It accumulates. The root systems go deeper each year. The soil around established perennials improves through their presence, through root activity, through organic matter, through the slow development of what gardeners sometimes call soil memory. The garden becomes incrementally more capable of feeding you, not because you work harder, but because you give it time. This is the inversion that most modern gardening culture does not prepare people for. The dominant model is one of continuous effort: prepare, plant, tend, harvest, and begin again. Every year the same amount of work, producing roughly the same result. A treadmill, not a garden. Perennial gardening operates on a fundamentally different timeline. The first year is an investment. The second year is a return on that investment. By the 5th year, the garden is doing work that you are not. By the 10th year, it has become something genuinely different from what you planted. Something more resilient, more productive, and more connected to the particular conditions of that soil and that climate than any annual crop could be. The plants covered in this video are not the whole of perennial gardening. They are an entry point. There are others, more obscure, more demanding, and in some cases, more rewarding. The deeper you go into this practice, the more apparent it becomes that what was lost in the shift to industrial agriculture was not just a set of plants, but a set of relationships between the gardener, the soil, and time itself. That is a recoverable loss. It begins with a single planting. We are building out written reference material on each of these plants, and many others, over on the Hidden Soil blog. The link is in the description. If you want to go beyond what a video can cover, that is where the deeper material will live. The gardeners who planted these roots understood something that most modern growers have had to unlearn: that the most productive garden is not the one that demands the most from you each season, but the one that requires the least, because it has been built over time to sustain itself. Egyptian walking onion, Jerusalem artichoke, sorrel. Plant one of them this season. Observe what happens in the 2nd year and the 3rd. The evidence accumulates slowly, which is precisely the point. If this video has been useful to you, subscribe to Hidden Soil and leave a like. Every video on this channel is built around the same premise, that there is a deeper record of how food was grown, how land was managed, and how gardens were designed to last. And that record is worth recovering. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. In the next video, several of the most nutritionally significant food plants ever documented have been systematically reclassified as weeds. We will examine how that happened, what was lost, and how to reintroduce them to a functioning garden.